Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. So my name is Dr. Lenora Powell, and I am the medical education specialist here at Genova's Atlanta branch, and I'm going to serve today as your moderator for the webinar. So for today, we are joined with the host of the Lab Report podcast. Welcome, Dr. Patti Devers and Dr. Michael Chapman. Welcome to the LiveGDX. We'll be sharing several clinical nuggets about test prep, methodologies, and specimen collection. And in case you miss a clinical pearl, you will have access to the presentation and the slide deck on our website within a few days after today's webinar. And you can access these resources, previous webinar recordings, brief video modules, other materials by just clicking on the clinicians tab on the home page. So please remember, we're here to support our clients, service their patients in office and via telemedicine. Genova Diagnostics offers many non-invasive urine, saliva, blood spot, and even stool collection packs that can be shipped directly to your patients for specimen collection at home. And the requisition can be completed online. So for more information, please go ahead and visit your MyGDX account. So hello, welcome doctors. How are you doing today?
Doing great, Lenore. Thank you.
Patti's crushing it as always. I'm doing well. Thank you.
That's right.
Very good. So let's go ahead and get started. Although Dr. Patti and Michael have been with Genova for about 5 years, in 2020 they took on this new endeavor, and they're basically the co-host of the podcast called the Lab Report. And so if you love all things functional medicine, specialty laboratory testing, integrative therapeutics, all wrapped up in witty banter, then you should definitely subscribe through either Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, RRS feed, which we will all have links for those on our website. And, I'm really privileged to know and call these docs my colleagues. So for their introduction, let's do something just a little bit different. Okay, instead of going through your impressive list of accomplishments, how about you guys introduce each other, share 3 interesting facts about the other. Who wants to start first?
I'll go first. So to your point, Lenore, if you go to the website, you read Michael's bio, he's a professional smarty pants. We all know that, and I'm honored that he's my BFF and partner in crime here. But 3 things you might not know about Michael Chapman. Number 1, he happens to be a musical genius. He had an undergrad music scholarship to go to school, and to this day plays the guitar and sings, and it's not uncommon for us to hear him playing his ukulele and singing down in his office. So he's a musical genius.
During my lunch break.
That's right. Number 2, he's actually fluent in sign language, and a lot of people don't realize that either. It's a pretty interesting skill to have, which is, oh, there he goes. And number 3, he's a pretty snappy dresser, which we all see and know, but what goes unseen are his socks. Sometimes he takes some leaps with the socks. Let's see him, Michael. What do you got today?
I got some Argyle. Gotta go with Argyle on a webinar Wednesday, right? That's the rule.
Crushing it.
So, yeah, some things that you might not know about Patti. Patti tends to be a little bit shy, a little introverted, kind of Midwestern in a lot of ways. So it's important to know some facts about her. First and foremost, she's a big tennis honk. She plays tennis and is a big fan of Federer, which I think really in the last couple of years being a fan of Federer is more so about what's that, rooting against Nadal and Djokovic? Isn't that kind of what what you're doing recently? She knows tap. She's a tap dancer, and so that comes in handy really well when she's maybe leaving a meeting or an office. She gives us a little minor tap routine on the way out of the office, so that's always entertaining. She does have this Rolodex memory. It's pretty amazing, actually, what she can just pull out of her head at a moment's notice. Like, for example, I'll just shoot off the hip.
Oh no,
Patti, what episode number was the minerals episode?
Oh, minerals, number 16, released on March 3rd.
There you go. I got one bonus one too.
Go ahead.
She hates bananas, like banana bread, banana anything, banana scented things. She has a diversion for banana. So
banana pudding?
Anything banana.
Yeah. What about you, Lenore? So tell us a little bit
Lenore,
about
how about you?
Okay, so I'm going to share 3 facts. 2 of them are going to be true, 1 of them is going to be false. So I'll let you guys guess which one is false, okay? So number 1, I am an NCAA Division II national qualifier in triple jump and multi-time state qualifier and placer in triple jump, long jump, 4x4, and high jump. Number 2, I studied abroad in Belgium for a year, where I attended secondary school, which is equivalent to in the US, basically high school, and I live with a host family, so French is like my second language, although I haven't used it a lot, so it is not really good in it anymore. And I was born on February 29th, which is leap day. So basically my birthday comes once every 4 years. So which statement is false?
I'm going to say leap day. I'm going to say leap day for sure.
I'm going to say the Belgium thing. I've never heard that from you.
Actually, they're all true. Yeah, my birthday is actually February 29th. So I do get to celebrate it once every 4 years. So I might be the youngest doctor that you guys have ever met.
Fair.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about the lab report. So you guys have aired nearly like 90 episodes. You have a very impressive lineup of guests, influencers in the field of exercise science, medicine, nutrition, covering a wide array of topics like the microbiome, unwanted guests like parasites. You talked about methylation, you talked about movement, brain fatigue, hormones, genetics, different diets, basically all things that relates to health and wellness. So let me pose this question for both of you all. What is your favorite episode? Why? And then give us like a really quick recap, so like a little teaser to kind of have us go back and listen to that episode.
This one's tough. This is tough because, yeah, like we've been doing this for almost a year now, and every single episode, Michael will admit, we learned so much from speaking to all these genius people and even just researching things ourselves. So we've learned so much. So to narrow it down, I'm gonna say there's a tie between 2. The first one was an interview we did with James Maskell, who's a health economist. And I love this interview because I have never heard anyone lay out the case for functional medicine and the future of functional medicine in the midst of a pandemic like James did, to the point where in the middle of the interview, I jumped out of my chair because I was so excited. Right, Michael?
Yeah, that happened. There was some of this going on, some fist pumps. Yeah.
So great. And if you're a functional medicine clinician listening to this, you need to go listen to that. It was episode number 28 and it released on May 1st. But additionally, there's another interview we did with Kelly Starrett of the Ready State. He's a PhD or a doctor of physical therapy, kind of trainer to the stars, Olympic athletes. In and of itself, he was just a huge functional medicine fan. But I found that this episode was profound. He said certain things, Michael, remember he said, pain is the body's request for change, or you're only as old as your feet. And he gave simple tips on mobility during that interview that have actually changed how I move in the world. It changed how I stand at my desk. It changed how I sit and watch television in the evening. So check out Dr. Starrett's. That was number 53 from July 28th. So you might want to check that one out too. How about you, Michael?
Nice. Yeah, I want to emulate what you were saying. You know, I think we've just been so blessed to have had the opportunity, not only from the amazing guests that we have had on, just a huge thanks to the participation and the interest from our guests, but also from Genova Diagnostics for, you know, putting this together and really being behind it 100%. You know, I just feel like we're super lucky to have this this thing going on that we're really excited about. But yeah, you know, as far as favorite interviews, favorite episodes, I don't know, it's hard to pick your favorite interview, and I don't want to alienate anyone out there, you know,
I know.
a favorite child. So I'm going to go off the board. I'm going to talk about one of the ones that we did, which was the gut-brain axis. And I love this one for a couple different reasons. The gut-brain axis is so interesting to me. Just the mere thought that our microbiome can be influencing our neurotransmitters, can therefore be influencing what we're thinking, what we're feeling, just these bugs in our gut. You know, it really flips the script on like who's controlling the system and how much is the individual versus the microbiome controlling the system. I find that so fascinating. And you know, another thing about that episode that I really like is I got to play around with this thought around turning famous people's names into produce items, which we call vegetabilization. So we got to have a little bit of fun in that episode. I think it came together really well. So
like Oprah Winfrey.
Yeah, Elvis Parsley.
Or Tina Turnip.
Nat King kohlrabi.
That's right. Benedict Cucumberbatch.
Nice.
Yeah.
I definitely remember that one because I was scratching my head really hard, like, think of a vegetable name. You can do it, Lenore. And I couldn't. I just really couldn't. You guys are genius in that aspect. Well,
you can always write them in to podcast@GDX.
That's right. Podcast@GDX.net.
There you go. There you go. And just to kind of echo what you said, Michael, I really like that episode as well, just because, you know, there's this big question, who has more genetic material, right? The microbiome or you as the person that houses the microbiome. And, you know, a lot of times we fail to neglect that the microbiome actually has more genetic material than we actually do, which is super duper cool. And this is why we call, you know, our gut our second brain. But actually, my favorite episode was another one that you guys did together. And it was actually the healing power of laughter.
Oh,
yeah, I really liked that episode. It just kind of came at a really good spot in my life where I just wasn't laughing enough, and it was really helpful. You know, just really talking about the psychological well-being and how it releases oxytocin and endorphins, how it improves pain threshold, it has cardiovascular benefits, and, you know, just going through how to write a prescription for laughter, I think was really enlightening because, you know, how long, what's the quality? Is it a really ha-ha or is it a he-he kind of a laughter, you know? It was just really fascinating to really hear about that. But I have a question for you all. So do they allow loud laughing in Hawaii, or is it just aloha? So there you go. I have just now increased your oxytocin and your endorphins for the day. You are so welcome. So as part of the lab report, there's a segment that you all do called Questions of the Day. And so we're not going to really deal with the jingle controversy today, y'all.
Thank you.
But in this segment, what I really like is that you guys actually address some of our most common received questions from clinicians. And so it might be fun to touch upon some of those FAQs and offer some clinical pearls, okay? So let's go ahead and address the very first clinical pearl / question. So something very common that we get asked is in regards to our nutrition panels, should we stop our supplements or medications, even for some of our other panels, prior to testing? So do we really have to stop it before we test? What's that whole?
It's a good question. It's a question we get all the time. And, you know, I think it's important to understand that there's this difference between this concept of a medication or a supplement that influences versus something that is an interferent. And so I'll explain that a little bit. So if something is influencing the test, that at the end of the day means that the biomarker result may look a little bit different than it normally would have. It might be a little bit higher than it normally would have, or maybe a little bit lower than it normally would have if somebody wasn't taking something. So that's what a medication or supplement that influences might do. An interferent is actually something that is going to halt our ability to run the test. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we won't be able to provide a result. So that is a good distinction to make, what this difference is between interference and things that might influence the test. And that can lead into, maybe Patti, you want to talk about whether clinicians should stop.
Yeah, and to the overall question, first and foremost, Genova never recommends that anyone stops any necessary medication to do testing. That's completely up to the clinician and to the patient. However, the answer is, to Michael's point, you don't have to stop medications. And in fact, a lot of clinicians choose to keep their patients on their normal supplements and medications just to either see the efficacy of their treatment, just kind of get a status of where they are. So if you're going to stop a medication, recognize that, you know, if it's an interferent, we can't run the test if you're on an interfering medication. But the influencing ones, understand that it may not fit into the reference range. And if you keep someone on one of these influencing medications, it might be helpful to call us here in medical education so we can walk through that test with you as it relates to the clinical picture. But because this question comes up so often, what we've done for our big flagship products like the NutrEval or the GI Effects is we've developed something called the test prep page. And if you go to the product page for the NutrEval or the product page for the GI Effects. Off to the right, you'll see additional resources. And it's the bottom link. You just click on test prep. And what we do here is we literally lay out what we know about certain medications and or supplements and how they might influence the test. Understanding we don't know how every single medicine is going to influence results. I mean, our answer 9 times out of 10 is we're not sure, but based on biochemistry and some literature, we're able to kind of give some guesses as to how it may influence.
Yeah, and an example might be, for example, digestive enzymes, right? So if somebody's doing a GI test, they're doing the GI Effects stool test, and you're having them continue their digestive enzymes, that might be something that's an influencer where you would be expecting and hoping that that digestive enzyme is helping the patient break down and absorb fat, break down and absorb protein a little bit better. And so by having them stay on that medication, you may get a little bit more of a false normal reading because the enzyme is assisting in the digestion and absorption process rather than if you were to take them off of that. And that can give you information. It can tell you, oh, actually the digestive enzyme is working. This is falling within normal range. That's what I'm wanting. Or you can have them come off the digestive enzyme, and that's more of an evaluation of what they're like at baseline. That's in contrast to something like charcoal. You know, if a patient is on charcoal and we do the test, then essentially, you know, oftentimes that will change the entire color of the stool sample, making it difficult for us to identify things like parasites under the microscope. So that's what we might consider to be more of an interferent. And that's just a little example to explain why it's important to know what things would be an interferent as compared to an influencer, why this page should help.
Wow, that's really helpful. Thank you. Is that kind of like the SG2LT inhibitors that people are taking with diabetes, how it causes you to excrete a lot of glucose out in the urine, which therefore, you know, we can't measure lipid peroxides, for example. Is that kind of the same idea there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you. And so let's move on to our next question as it relates to this word sensitivity and specificity of our testing of the biomarkers. I know there's lab definitions for things, and then there's general population definitions for things. So help us to understand what this means in a laboratory context, please.
Well, I think important to note is exactly what you just said. We get that question asked to us a lot. What's the sensitivity of the GI effects, or what's the specificity of your NutrEval? And I think there's a very important distinction to be made there when we talk about sensitivity and specificity. There's the clinical aspect of it, and then there's the actual laboratory analytical piece of it. So clinically, it really speaks to how good is this test at ruling a disease in or out versus when you're talking about a laboratory kit for a specific biomarker. And so that comes to the whole concept of biomarker versus panel, Michael.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really important to make that distinction. I think a lot of times when we get questions about sensitivity and specificity, it's a question of, you know, the GI Effects dual profile, what's the sensitivity and specificity? When really, when you're talking about sensitivity and specificity, you're asking the question, how good is this single biomarker at ruling in or ruling out a clinical condition? So an example would be the C. difficile enzyme amino acid, the EIA for C. difficile. The question then becomes, how good is it at determining whether somebody has C. diff or not? And so what we do is we take patients who we know have C. diff infection, and then we compare the C. diff EIA test, and we say, okay, 99% of the time when the patient has C. diff that we know of, it was positive, and then vice versa for specificity. When we take a group of people we know are negative for C. diff, this marker can predict how often, 99% of the time, that it's accurate in telling us that they don't have that condition. So the take home there is that sensitivity and specificity relates to how a biomarker can accurately predict whether or not somebody has a specific disease. When you extrapolate that to a big profile like the GI effects, where we're looking for maldigestion, we're looking for short chain fatty acid production, we're looking for a lot of different things, then you can't get a overall sensitivity specificity because the terminology is not really it doesn't align sensitivity specificity is what disease are we talking about? What biomarker are we talking about?
Yeah, so I think when we talk about it, or when clinicians write in to ask us these questions, it's important to be very clear about the question you're asking, because we always come at it from that clinical perspective. Like Michael said, just the overall clinical perspective versus the analytical. So be very clear about those distinctions there.
Yeah.
Nice, very nice. I like how you guys tease that apart, because that is very important. So let's talk about another really hot topic, and it's actually yeast. Okay, so as we know that, there's different ways in which we can assess yeast. There's blood testing, there's organic acids, there's stool testing. So let's go more toward stool testing. How does Genova evaluate GI yeast, and what are those methods?
Yeah, great question. And on the GI effects, first and foremost, we actually measure it via culture, where they're taking the stool samples, put them on culture medium plate to see what yeast grows. And we can give you a semi-quantitative look at how much is there. The good thing about culture is that the fact that it's growing on a culture plate implies that it's alive, right? So if it's present, we can then actually take that specific yeast species and run sensitivities to that live yeast, which is important clinically. The second way we look at yeast on the GI effects is something called the KOH prep, or the potassium hydroxide prep. And what this does is you take the stool and you apply this stain, and you can look under a microscope to see, number one, if yeast is present. Oftentimes we're looking for budding yeast, which is what's being circled there, to kind of get a feel for, is it replicating? But I think important to note is that we can't tell whether it's live or dead under the prep. And we know that just from our data, greater than 95% of all KOH preps are positive for some yeast, because it's in our food, it's in the air. And again, you don't know if it's live or dead, but some clinicians find it helpful to gain a little bit more understanding of the yeast burden. But this leads to the other question that often comes up around PCR.
Yeah, and the eternal yeast question, right? So I think PCR is another thing that we should be considering, should be talking about as it relates to evaluation for yeast. I think there's two things to understand about PCR evaluation for yeast. Is the first one being what Patti was talking about. PCR is analyzing DNA material. And so if you're quantifying DNA material, you don't know how much of that DNA material is coming from an organism that is live or dead. Right, and so that's always, and as Patti mentioned, we're constantly being exposed to yeast in our diet, through just the air we're breathing. We're constantly being exposed to that, and the body is managing and taking care of a lot of it as well, as evidenced by the fact that we do see, an overwhelming majority of people showing up with positive yeast in the KOH prep, but not necessarily in the culture analysis, which gives you this idea that there's we're constantly shedding yeast in our GI tract, and that's not always indicative of what's viable yeast living in the microbiome. And that takes me to the second point with respect to the microbiome, is we know that yeast are supposed to be in the GI tract. We know that the GI tract consists of Saccharomyces, Candida, Malassezia species. And the thing is that when this has been studied in the literature, a lot of times we're evaluating it via whole genome sequencing. And what that tells you is relative abundance of yeast in the GI tract. So for example, just making up numbers here, there's 60% of the yeast is Saccharomyces, 30% of the yeast is Candida, 10% is Malassezia, and I'm just making those numbers up. But it's essentially telling you relative proportions of yeast. But if you're doing a PCR analysis for yeast and you're trying to do a quantitation, we haven't established what actually normal levels are. We don't know, okay, this is the threshold at which Candida becomes an overgrowth situation rather than just becoming part of the microbiome. And I think the last thing, the three things, I mentioned two, but the third thing is that when you're testing for PCR for yeast, we would be expecting a lot of positives, just because we know that it's in the microbiome and we're seeing it on the KOH prep. So you have to establish then what is a normal amount. And I think that's still where we're trying to figure out those odds and ends in the literature.
And I just want to add something really quick before we move to the next clinical pearl, is I always like to tell clinicians, treat the patient, not the test result.
Sure.
You also want to see those symptoms that signify we have issues with yeast. That can be anything from foggy thinking, memory difficulties, joint aches and pains, skin bumps, lesions, itchiness, genital urinary symptoms, GI tract symptoms as well. And if your patient displays even carbohydrate cravings, if your patient displays some of these symptoms, then we do need to consider looking at treatment. And I'm not sure about you all, but for me, what treatment looks like is there's a big dietary component when it comes to yeast. You
Sure.
don't want to feed them. So it's decreasing the sugar, the yeasted, the molded foods, as well as looking at some kind of a anti-yeast, whether it's a botanical or whether it is a more of a prescriptive agent. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
No, I always go to diet first, actually, depending. That's the biggest one. I think the biggest driver is decreasing sugar and carbohydrates and wine and things like that in the diet is a good place to go, depending on the clinical presentation of the patient, obviously.
Yeah, I think everyone's going to have a little bit of a different clinical opinion around when they start treating. And that's one of the reasons why on the report, for a general Candida species, maybe not a Candida albicans, we wait until 4+ growth before we call it a potential pathogen. And even then, we're calling it a potential pathogen, right? Which is just telling you, okay, this may or may not be causing some issues. And so you start comparing that to the clinical picture and then determining, okay, is this a conversation about sugar avoidance? And we just need to limit that because maybe it's a normal member of the microbiome, but it's just gotten an opportunity to overgrow a little bit based on the diet. Or do we need to go in with some heavier hitters?
Absolutely. And trying to figure out the root cause too, right? That's what we're all about as functional medicine clinicians is what is the root cause? Do we have an insulin glucose issue if somebody keeps getting recurrent yeast infections? Is there something going on with the immune system? Do we have an autoimmune disease? Is there a chronic viral or chronic bacteria infection that has not been identified? It's really about just understanding, especially in those patients that keep getting yeast infections, like why? What's going on here?
Yeah, is there a microbiome deficiency, right? We always talk about the more free real estate that's available, the more opportunity we have for some of these least attractive organisms. They start to take hold and overgrow.
Most definitely. So let's go ahead to the next topic or the next clinical pearl. So when it comes to our nutrition tests, there are several different words that are kind of thrown out there. We hear words like intracellular, extracellular. We hear words like functional versus direct assessment. Can you guys touch upon what are those terms mean in a laboratory context, and what's the difference, and what does Genova add to nutrition testing?
Sure.
Yeah. That's a great question, and it's pretty common. So most of our nutritional tests are a combination of both direct and what we call functional. And when we think about a direct measurement of a nutrient, it's exactly what you'd expect even in the conventional world, where you go to a conventional lab, they take your serum, they're looking at a level of a specific nutrient, which is great. However, there are some limitations to that, though in some instances, it's the preferred way to do it, like something like vitamin D, like we measure directly. Vitamin D, we measure it directly. However, if you can consider that, something like potassium, right? Genova measures it directly in red blood cell, for example. Whereas if you go to conventional lab, their direct measurement in the serum is remarkably different because it's very tightly controlled based on your renal function and your acid base status. And so what Genova's done is we've looked to see where is the best matrix for which to assess each nutrient. And that's kind of how we've built our profiles around nutrition. But the direct is exactly that, just looking at that direct nutrient. Functional is a little bit trickier, and it's necessary because in functional medicine we often talk about there's a difference between being normal within a normal range versus optimal, and I think that's where functional assessments come in.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the things to understand about functional assessment is it is looking at these biochemical pathways, and we're looking at what's going on inside the cell when we're doing a functional assessment, because there's all of these different biochemical processes occurring all the time. And to Patti's point, right, we can do a direct measurement for things like B12, but there's some evidence to show that maybe that is not necessarily telling us what is happening within the actual biochemistry, and that occasionally when people are actually within the normal reference range, it's floating around at normal levels in the serum, there's still some biochemical pathways that are struggling to utilize it a little bit. And so that's where something like a functional assessment comes in. And what we're looking at here on the screen is just an example of all these different metabolic pathways. And you can start to see, you know, there's cofactors in some of these. Like here you see NAD and NADH, which relates to vitamin B3. And so it might be an indication if that pathway that is vitamin B3 dependent is sluggish or all jammed up, as we say, then that's going to be an indication that the patient might need more B3, even if their circulating B3 levels are normal. And there's also a kind of a side bit to this where, you know, a lot of times we haven't established that the direct measurement of, say, serum B3, you know, how effective that is at telling us the overall status of vitamin B3. So on something like our nutritional test, the NutrEval, the Metabolomics Plus, like Patti mentioned, we're combining direct measurements alongside these functional assessments. And oftentimes there's tens of biomarkers. You know, for vitamin B12, there's like around 16 or 18 different biomarkers that relate to pathways that are B12 dependent, and that all kind of feeds into one big algorithm to spit out your overall need for vitamin B12. So that's the difference between a direct assessment and a functional assessment. But Patti's right, at the end of the day too, we're doing both an intracellular and extracellular assessment. So we're combining everything on our nutritional testing.
So the way in which I really like to explain functional medicine or functional assessment of nutrients to clients who might not be aware is I kind of like to go back to basic biochemistry, and I say what we're trying to do is we're trying to convert A into B, and moving A into B, you use an enzyme, and that enzyme has a whole host of cofactors it needs to operate. And so if you have an accumulation of A, like what we measure in our organic acid testing, then that means that you might not have the right cofactors to move it forward into B. And so having high amounts of A triggers us to realize that, oh, you might not have the good stuff. But also, you know, some things that we also need to consider when it comes to kind of functional testing organic acids is, you know, kind of what are other reasons your pathways might not be progressing forward? Is it just a lack of nutrient deficiencies? Or could it be genetics? Could it be a medication? Could it be heavy metals, for example? But I think that's just a really great way to kind of explain just the basics of functional medicine, how we test for nutrients and things like that. And so before we move on to the next slide, if you all can just touch upon, I'm sure you have reviewed plenty, I'm kind of putting you on the spot, but I'm sure you guys have reviewed plenty pre-test, post-test treatments, and I'm sure you guys have reviewed many tests where clients are like, but my patient's already on a supplement regimen. Why do they still have this need for nutrients? I think that's another really big question that comes about. How do you guys like to typically address those questions where they're either on a supplement regimen or this is the follow-up test to make sure the supplement regimen is going well, but yet they still have a need for certain nutrients?
Such a good question. Yeah, and I think, you know, one specific answer to that might be maybe they're not digesting and absorbing. You know, maybe there's a GI issue. Maybe they're not even getting that nutrient, or maybe it's not quite enough. But there's other influences too, day to day, Michael, right?
Yeah, and I was going to say, like, a classic example of this is like vitamin C, where on a nutritional test, somebody will be taking vitamin C and we'll see that they have still a borderline or a high need of vitamin C, and clinician patients like, well, I'm taking this, I don't understand. And it really comes back to that conversation about functional versus direct measurement and explaining, okay, we're not directly measuring vitamin C on the test. What we're measuring is signs of oxidative stress, right? We're measuring lipid peroxides, which is oxidative stress damage to lipids, and we're measuring 8-OH-DG, which is oxidative stress damage to DNA. Those things are still elevated. right? So the vitamin C that's on board might be helping. They may actually have been higher had the patient not been on vitamin C, but you know, that we're still seeing signs of oxidative stress. So we need to, as you were saying, get back to the root cause and evaluate what's triggering all this oxidative stress. You know, where's the free radical exposure coming from? Where's the toxic exposure coming from, and lowering those things? Because at the end of the day, vitamin C might help, but you've got to get to understanding what's triggering some of that root cause.
Yeah, and some of those things like toxic exposures can change day to day, right? So, and your diet can change. So it's important to make that connection for clinicians. They think just by taking this supplement, I'm going to be fine, but you do have to get to that root cause and really kind of work that out with them so that they understand. They can look at the test in that way.
The other thing too that I also consider is increased utilization. So there are some individuals who are in a state of increased utilization. So let's think about your athletes who are running marathons, who are your weekend warriors, riding their bike for like, 10, 15 miles on the weekends. Their demand for certain nutrients is going to be higher than somebody else. And even for women who are lactating, for us, there is a higher demand for various nutrients like amino acids and other things like that. And so you also have to be well aware of what is your patient's current demand for those nutrients. And it kind of brings me to a live that I did, I think about a week ago or so, and it talked about how do you cook your foods, because the way in which because a lot of patients are like, but I eat great, my nutrition panel should look excellent, but it's like, but you boil the crap out of everything, or you fry the bleep out of everything, so you also have to look at which way do you prepare your foods, and also in terms of supplements, which form of the supplement are you giving your patient? Are you giving your patient a one a day that's ultra compacted and they have low stomach acid, or they don't have the capabilities of breaking down that one a day, pill, or are you giving them in more of a powder form or more of a liquid form? These are all things to also consider as well.
Yeah, so, and if you're frying things with olive oil in high heat, that's contributing to your lipid peroxides, and that's showing you why you need.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
And it might be contributing to your trans fats, because when you heat up olive oil to too high of a temperature, and when it starts to smoke, it degrades possibly into even trans fat. So most definitely, absolutely. I really like the conversation that you just had about vitamin C. I think that's really a great kind of segue into this latter question that I want to ask you all. But I also think about vitamin C. We talk about the oxidative stress markers like lipid peroxides and 8-OH-GG, but glutathione can also be another marker that can push the need for vitamin C, because vitamin C, along with selenium, milk thistle, alpha-lipoic acid, those are what are called recyclers to help move your glutathione into a state of more of a reduced state where your body can use it, versus the oxidized state in which your body has already kind of used up all of its good juju. So, that's something else that could also trigger the need for vitamin C. It just might be that your glutathione is either being used pretty quickly, which we'll look at pyroglutamate, or it can be a sign that you might not have enough glutathione, and we can just look at its direct measurement.
Yeah, and on the test result, right, we're measuring total glutathione levels. And so you get back to like biochemical root causes, like what is the reason why somebody might have lower glutathiones? Could that be an amino acid deficiency? Could that be needs for vitamin B6 or magnesium, which are the cofactors to create? But you're right, at the end of the day, what we're saying is, hey, your glutathione is looking a little bit low. Your capacity to deal with free radicals and oxidative stress is reduced. Let's supplement, or let's provide in some, whether it's food or a supplementation form, let's provide additional antioxidant support to mitigate the fact that you have low glutathione levels.
Yeah, and just review those amino acids real quick for everybody.
So we've got glutamic acid.
Yep, cysteine and glycine. And then B6 and zinc also help as well.
Okay. So let's go ahead and move. I think, again, that's a great segue in terms of this toxic conversation. We have several profiles that evaluate a patient's toxic exposure or exposure to various environmental things. We're not really measuring body burden. I think that's really important to note, but we're assessing your actual exposure. So how should a clinician decide which tests to order? Because, we have urine testing, we have blood testing. How do you decide?
Yeah, it's a great point. And the point you made initially is the fact that this is exposure, not necessarily body burden, is important. And it's not going to tell you, I was exposed to mercury when I was 4 years old. These are fairly recent exposures. And it depends, what time frame you're looking at. If we're talking about the urine ordinarily gives a fairly recent exposure, 24 to 48 hours, depending on the toxin we're talking about. And so you take into account that time frame. And the urinary evaluation for exposures of toxins, there are standalone profiles called the toxic elements clearance profile, which measures 20 various urinary toxins that you may have been exposed to. There's the comprehensive urine elements profile, which combines that with some urinary nutrients that may have been wasted in the meantime. But both of those profiles can also be added on to our new Metabolomics Plus profile, which is a at-home collection, non-invasive nutritional profile. So it's a way to add to, look at your nutritional status and then get a feel for your urinary toxic exposures. But that brings us to blood, Michael.
Yeah, from a blood standpoint, what we're thinking about is we've got a little bit of a longer window of time, right? We think about the life cycle of a red blood cell, and that tends to be somewhere between 90 and 120 days. And so what we're doing on something like the NutrEval, where you can do the add-on for toxic elements on the NutrEval, that's a whole blood assessment. Whole blood is going to be a combination of red blood cell and serum, right? So it's hard to understand exactly what that window of time is. I tend to put it at around maybe like a month or so, because you're combining the serum, which turns over every couple of weeks, and you're combining the red blood cell. But that gives a little bit of a longer window of exposure time. So if you want to look and say, okay, maybe over the course of the last month or so, what has my patient been exposed to? Then that might be where I would opt for something like the NutrEval with the add-ons for the toxic elements. Or if you just wanted to do that individually, there's the elemental analysis profile. I mean, the only downside to that is, right, it's a little bit more invasive. It requires a blood draw. So that's a little bit of that negotiation that from a clinical ordering standpoint, you might want to have.
And so with our urine testing at Genova, you have the option of ordering it to be ratio to volume.
Yeah.
Or a ratio to creatinine. Can you guys go into that in a little bit more detail? Like, why would I consider one over the other? And with retesting, do I keep the same methods or do I change it up? Like, can you guys just kind of go over that a little bit?
Yeah, so you can, like Lenore said, you can just do, a timed collection, just one first morning void, which would be ratio to your creatinine as a standardization. You can do 24 hours, collect all of your urine or a significant amount of time, and they ratio it to volume. I think important to note is that, one timed collection is usually fairly good for most people. And some people use it in a way when they start to treat with chelation. They'll do a one-time first morning void, give some type of chelating agent, and then repeat the test. So some people use it that way. Important to note was your second point, where if you are repeating a test, just try to see if something is cleared. We try to go apples to apples, right? Instead of, one is ratio to volume, one's ratio to creatinine. So that's an important point. But Michael, anything else you want to add to that?
No, I agree. I mean, I think in general, my understanding of it is that historically there was a lot of protocols that worked with a 24-hour collection. And so that's where kind of the origins of the ratio to volume came from. And then if you're doing smaller windows of time, then it becomes necessary to ratio to creatinine, because we have to account for the dilution of the urine sample. And so I think in general, it's just a general rule, it tends to be prudent to order ratio to creatinine, because you're not always going to know with 100% certainty the window of time that the patient is going to collect. And so you cover all your bases by doing that. But that being said, I think there's a lot of clinicians that have a very specific protocol that they're used to following, and that includes the 24-hour.
And in terms of management, right? Somebody who comes back and we see that they have a high level of, let's just use mercury for today's conversation. How do you really manage it? I know for me, I try to be very basic. I'm like, where is it coming from? Decrease exposure, eliminate exposure, antioxidants, and get it out of the body. Like, how do you guys like to approach it?
Exactly that. We're looking to see a little bit of detective work, right? Where is this coming from? What's that source? And minimize or completely eliminate it. We often send clinicians to the CDC website, the ATSDR, which kind of lists each environmental toxin, specific possible places you may be exposed to these things. So I think you're right. First and foremost, you need to investigate where is this coming from and do your best to eliminate it. Was it food? Is it water? Is it your soil? You know, just look, is it your cosmetics? Is it supplements you're taking? All of these are very common sources of toxins that people don't think about. And then even, you know, we talk about supporting detoxification. So how do you do that, Michael, support detox?
Yeah, I mean, I think about the sink analogy, right? The body is always kind of evaluating what's coming in and then what's draining out of the sink. And the more that you can limit what's coming into the sink in the form of mercury, the more your body is going to be able to drain the sink with its detoxification capacity. So, you know, first and foremost is the reduction from the exposure standpoint. From the elimination standpoint, or the detoxification standpoint, you know, there's lots of things in our functional medicine toolkit that we can use. You know, I tend to, instead of, you always meet the patient where they're at. You know, some patients might be a little bit more ready, gung-ho, to take on more of a strict detox, and we can talk about the inclusion of different types of intermittent fasting or things like that. But at the end of the day, your diet is your detox, right? Like what is coming in is what is allowing your body to have the adequate nutrition to do its regular detoxification. And sure, things like leafy green vegetables, things like parsley, celery, cilantro, things like that are well known as being a little bit more effective from a chelation of heavy metal standpoint and detoxification. But at the end of the day, it's all about what your lifestyle is, and that's going to translate into how well the sink is draining.
I also would check in with the gut, you know, consider a stool test just to make sure the gut's moving. You want to look specifically at something like beta-glucuronidase, which in essence would just recirculate toxins back into the enteric circulation. So, you know, these are all things that you can do to support a patient who has some type of a toxic exposure. But I think we all agree, look for the source first, and let's just turn off the sink. Turn off the water to Michael's point. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Because that's going to ultimately bind, right? That's phase 3 detoxification. That's going to be what's responsible for binding up all those things that you're detoxifying, making sure they're carried out of the system.
That's right.
Absolutely. And then I also like to throw in there too, genetics, right?
Sure.
There's going to be some people who are just predisposed to having lower glutathione levels, to having problems with clearing things like Patti, you brought up beta-glucuronidase. You know, that might be an example of that too, because there is a gene link to that, GUSB, I believe it is. But you know, we also have to be mindful of what is their methylation capabilities, because there is an aspect of methylation required for detoxification. So there are a bunch of other things that, you know, we can look into as well, like how is your CYP3A4 enzyme system working and other things like that. So I think that's also important to look into as well, or help to support when you're managing a patient who has toxic exposure. And so I would just like to ask, kind of wrapping up here, I would just like to ask in terms of what is your favorite profile that Genova offers? And then tell us a little bit about that profile. And even if you want to, I'll start off. So for me, I have an unusual obsession with women who are managing the postpartum time frame. And so for me, in those women, what we typically experience is extreme fatigue. And a lot of people chalk it up to, oh, well, it's because you just had a baby. But sometimes the amount of fatigue we're experiencing is not normal. So unfortunately, I don't have one favorite test for women in this category. I'm breaking my own rules, so disrespectful. But I do feel that nutrition testing is very important in this group, because after having a baby, your demand for iron and other nutrients like B vitamins, it's different. You just, delivered a human. So, you know, and you're potentially breastfeeding. And so the micronutrient demand is really high. If I was to wave a magic wand, I would also like to see like adrenal testing done in these groups, as well as hormone testing, because you know, during pregnancy, your hormone levels are really high. And then after you deliver your baby, they say that your hormone levels plummet to the range of a menopausal lady. And then you got to kind of sort your way back up to normal menstruating levels of these hormones. And so sometimes even considering hormonal testing, looking at the thyroid, that whole endocrine system. So for me, in that group of people, that would be my favorite suite, I'm going to say, of tests to order. So you guys can either share your favorite tests or suite of tests you like to order in a certain condition.
Michael?
Sure.
Oh, no, I'll go. No, I would say my my favorite profile to talk about in consults is probably the one-day hormone check, because to your point, Lenore, you really have to talk about how all these hormones work in concert. You know, you bring in the HPA axis, you're bringing in the sex hormones, and you have the conversation about thyroid. So that's fun. But when I first came here to Genova and started working in medical affairs, the test that scared me the most was the NutrEval, because it's a behemoth. And I think when we speak to new clinicians on the phone, they kind of feel that way too. Like, this is overwhelming. You get to the Krebs cycle page and people's eyes cross. But once I got into this test and I understood like the genius of organic acids and putting it all together, amino acids and fatty acids and toxins and oxidative stress, I became obsessed with this and really dove into that biochemistry. So it's fun when we're talking to clinicians to kind of show them like, no, this is really cool. Don't be scared of this. And this is where that biochemical individuality comes from. So those are two I would point out.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you know, the GI Effects is a fantastic test, and it's, you know, the thing about the GI Effects that I really love is it really does evaluate like any sort of functional core issue to the GI tract that I might be concerned about, right? Like, it doesn't leave anything behind when you're evaluating things that can go wrong from a GI perspective. And so I think that's one thing that makes that such a powerful test. But, you know, I also agree with Patti, like the breadth of information that you get from a NutrEval is just, it's unrivaled, because you're getting organic acid testing, which is a better way to assess for B vitamin status. But then you combine that with direct measurements of minerals and things like that. Then you combine that with amino acids to tell you about protein sufficiency and insufficiency and maybe dysfunctions in amino acid metabolism. And then lastly, it's almost like, oh, by the way, there's also a fatty acid analysis here too. So we can look at your balance between omega-3, 6, 9, saturated, unsaturated, trans fats, all those things too. So it's like, there's so much information on that test that it's really hard to ignore. It's great.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I just want to personally thank you all for coming on LiveGDX today and just having a really open, candid conversation discussing some really common clinical pearls that we hear about on a regular basis. And I just want to thank you for also entertaining my my thought process of, okay, well, how do you treat in these cases? And just answering the questions of just different things that you guys know about each other that other people might not know, because they just know you from the podcast, but they might not know that, you know, Dr. Chapman has the most awesome socks in the world, and you know, Patti has a memory of just genius. You know, they might not know these things. So I really appreciate you all just taking time out of your busy days and just chatting with me for a little bit. So I want to let all clinicians know, if you would like additional educational materials, you know, on our website, www.gdx.net, or you can contact client services, but we are updating things on a pretty consistent basis in terms of new materials that are flying out there and we're throwing up on our website. And so I would definitely encourage you all to check out the website and all the goodness that we have to offer. We also have complimentary appointments with our medical education specialists. So we are just 3 of the medical education specialists on our amazing team that you may have the opportunity to talk with to really review the profiles. And don't be afraid if you want to call and just go over a sample report, because this is a brand new test. Like, oh, Dr. Patti talked about the one-day hormone check. I've never ran that before. What is that really about? You can give us a call and we'll walk through the test, the sample reports with you. Also, if you are having difficulty choosing which test to really start with for your patient, you could also give us a call and we'll help you all navigate that territory as well. We do have some, every month, we do webinars, and so please keep your eye on our website, www.gdx.net. You can also check out the podcast. Definitely. I see that we have some people who are saying, I love the podcast. And the podcast loves you as well.
We love you too.
So definitely, continue to check out the podcast. Do you guys know who our next upcoming speakers are, or is there somebody that you would like to interview in the future?
I just want to point out, we like when people email us with ideas of who they'd like to hear. So we're always open to those. But go to iTunes, go to Spotify, go to the website. There's actually a landing page for the podcast where you can link to actually listen to the episodes right from the landing page.
Yeah. We're going to have some really great interviews coming up. We're also, just as a sneak preview, we're talking all about B12 coming up as well in our next episode. And if anyone is familiar, knows a way to get in contact with Neil deGrasse Tyson, to get him on the podcast for some time now.
We're not giving up. We're not giving up.
So if there's a contact point out there, then feel free to email podcast@gdx.net.
Well said,
That's
sir.
amazing. And I just want to remind people that the podcast is on several different mediums. It's on Apple Podcasts. You can access it through Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and the RRS feed. And on our website, if you just type in the search box, the lab report, you also will have direct links that you can click, and it just, takes you right to the podcast, and you can see the amazing 90 or so episodes. So if you guys are a little late knowing about this podcast, you got about 90 episodes to work your way through. Okay, so again, I just want to thank you all for just spending a little bit of time with me today. And I hope everybody has a wonderful day, has a very safe holiday. And we look forward to interacting with you all in the future. Thank you so much, everybody. Enjoy.
Thanks, everyone.